Hello Year 9, welcome to your streaming lesson for this week. This is part one of two lessons which will, and the second lesson will be coming to you at some point before the summer holidays. Okay, so the whole point of the two lessons is to get you to start thinking about drawing links between the poems that you've studied this year. So today's lesson is very much focused on a sort of overview of that. We're going to look at the main similarities and differences and like the bigger picture. And then towards the end of the lesson, we are going to zoom in and look at perspectives of conflict and impact of conflict. So these are two categories that we can specifically look at to look for similarities and differences between the poem. So we're going to go in the lesson from being very generic and looking at an overview to being a bit more specific and looking at specific features of the poems and looking at specific categories in our comparison. Okay, I'm going to see how we get on for time. I might leave some of that to the second lesson if this lesson ends up running quite long. Okay, so why are we doing this? Now, I know it seems a long way off, but for your GCSE in 2 whole years' time, you will be asked to compare two poems with the same theme. So obviously you've been learning these war poems. And one of the things you have to do with the war poems is just analyse one poem by itself. The other thing is comparing two poems. So all we're asking you to do here in Year 9 is to start thinking about comparisons you can make, so similarities and differences between the two poems, so that next year in Year 10, when you learn about more of the poems, you'll be able to build on that and have a look at developing your comparison skills further. Okay, so we're going to start off with a quick quiz to see what you can remember about the poems that you've studied, and I believe it's out of 9, but let's check my maths in a minute. So you don't need to write down the question. Sorry, I should have said, can you make your title drawing links between the poems in your books, please, or on pieces of paper if you've run out of space. And then underneath, you do not have to write the question out, just jot down the answers. Okay, question 1, I'm starting with an obvious question. Can you list the titles of the 5 war poems that you've studied? Okay, so this is the 5 poems you've studied since after Easter time. Just jot them down, try not to cheat, try not to look back, see what you can remember. Okay, pause here while you do that. Question 2, all 5 poems are written by men, true or false? Pause again while you answer. Question 3, 3 poems are centred around World War I. What are they? You can just use little short titles if you want to, save you writing them out again. Pause while you answer. Number 4, modern war poems celebrate war and dying for your country. Is this true or false? You just need to write down true or false. And question 5, 2 poems are written from a wife's perspective. What are they? So which poem do we get an insight into a wife's experience from? Okay, pause there if you need more time to answer, and then I will go through the answers. Okay, so question 1, hopefully you got them all. So this is out of 5. Don't worry if you didn't get them all, because that's the whole point of this lesson. So The Soldier, Dulce, Mammoth's Wood, Wife in London, and The Manhunt. If there were any that you've forgotten, really should be helping you to realise that that's the poem or they're the poems that you might want to revisit. You will be given time to revisit these at the start of Year 10, but fingers crossed if everything goes according to plan. But in the meantime, it might be something that you want to look over, and even for these 2 lessons that will be streamed, you will probably benefit from having looked over them, because we are going to be talking about all 5 of these poems. Okay, question 2, it is indeed true. So yep, they're all written by men, the war poems. There are some female writers in the anthology, you'll be glad to know. But yeah, the war ones are all written by men. Okay, the 3 that are centred around World War I are The Soldier, Dulce, and Mammoth's Wood. So that is out of 3. So my maths was definitely wrong, because we're already out of 5, 6, 7, 8. We're already out of 9 marks. Question 4. It is false that modern war poems celebrate war and dying for your country. That is what traditional war poems do. So if you remember way back to the start when we were looking at features of modern war poems and traditional war poems, modern war poems tend to expose the horrors of war and the psychological long-term impacts of war. Traditional war poems are the ones that celebrate dying for your country. Okay. And finally, the 2 that are written from a wife's perspective are A Wife in London and The Manhunt. So by my maths, that's out of 12. So if you give yourself a mark out of 12, hopefully you did well. If there's anything there that's not ringing a bell or is causing any confusion, just get in touch with the teacher, or you can contact me instead if you'd like to. Yeah, hopefully that's all ringing a bell, and that gives you a nice sort of recap of the poems that you've been studying. Also, to help with that, we're now going to have a look at this quick activity as well. So, which poem am I? So I'm going to describe a poem, and I would just like you to jot down which poem it is. So again, just to rejig your memory, make sure you've got a nice overview in your head of what each poem is about. So, I make the reader think that war is a glorious opportunity to serve my country. So which poem am I? Jot down your answer. Remember to just pause at any point if you need more time. Number 2, I make the reader think that war is costly and creates great loss. Number 3, that could actually be more than one, so you might want to hang fire on that one so you've seen the others. Number 3, I make the reader feel horrified by the reality of war, or at the reality of war, or about the reality of war. Number 4, I make the reader realise the long-term psychological effects of war. And finally, number 5, I make the reader realise that although war can unite soldiers, it also wastes lives and can affect the land. All right, so pause there, make sure you've got a good go at those. Okay, answers. The first one is The Soldier. We've got that sonnet, haven't we, where he's full of patriotism and jingoism and promoting dying for his country. The second one is A Wife in London. Now, really, that could have also been Dulce as well. And that off the top of my head. I was thinking A Wife in London because of that idea of what war has cost in the last stanza, and the way it's cost them their future and all these new opportunities to learn to love and in a different way and grow together. Dulce for number 3. I feel like anything to do with horrific is usually Dulce, because his language is so horrific, isn't it? And so realistic, and just makes you feel horrified by war. Number 4, the psychological effects is the Manhunt. So this is where we're thinking about PTSD and that long-term sort of alteration of personality, and losing yourself after war and not really knowing sort of how to function in a modern world when you've seen such horrors. And then the last one is Mammoth's Wood. So we got that lovely image at the end of the soldiers kind of united in death, but actually, they are the quote wasted young, and the earth is standing sentinel, and they're still finding relics in the soil, aren't they, from the war? So it's been damaged long term. Okay, so that one's Mammoth's Wood. All right, again, if any of that you think, oh, I've no memory of that being what that poem's about, then it might be worth pausing now and just going back and rereading the poem. To help you out with that, I have attached this, or you should have had this attached to show my homework. So this is all of the poems on one sheet, as you can see. If you have access to a printer, it'd be worthwhile printing out. But if you haven't, don't worry. It's just a way of you kind of seeing all of the poems in one go. But obviously you've got individual copies of the poems as well. Okay. Right, so for our first job, like I said, we're going to start off with a really big overview, and we're going to start thinking about which poems have the most in common. Okay, so we're imagining we're at speed dating. Who's going to have the most in common? Who's going to sit down and click straight away and say, you think like I think, or oh, that's similar to me. So we're going to fill in this table, and I'm going to ask you to have a go first, and pause the video, and then I'm going to go through the answers with you. So if you obviously you've got your questions down the left hand side, and then you've got each of the poems across the top. So if you draw this out for me, nice and big, nice and clear on your page, pause the video, have a go, and then once you're ready and you've answered what you can, unpause and I'll go through the answers. If you need to look back at your notes, then do, because that's what they're there for, but challenge yourself first to fill it in without having to look back. Okay, pause now. Okay, here are our answers then. So I'm going to go down poem by poem. Can you tick off what you've got right, and can you add on in a different colour the ones that you need to tweak or correct? So firstly, Soldier is definitely World War I. It was at the start of World War I. It's written from the perspective of a soldier, so a soldier's perspective. It's definitely a traditional war poem because it celebrates the idea of dying for your country. It was written in 1914 at the start of World War I. It's definitely very positive about conflict. And technically, if you remember, Brooks did not fight in the conflict. He didn't fight in the war, but he did try to. He aimed to. Do you remember he was bitten by a mosquito? And he didn't really ever make it into battle. So technically, no is the answer there. But if you've put, yes, I can understand why. Just make a note of that little detail. Okay, moving on to Dulce. Also World War One. We again have a soldier's perspective. So Dulce and the soldier are looking quite similar at the minute, aren't they? They've got a lot in common so far. This is where they depart though, because Dulce is definitely a modern war poem, and if you remember, it was almost the start of modern war poetry, the first time we really got a realistic presentation of war. It was written in 1916, so that's the difference 2 years have made to how people feel about the war. It's definitely negative. I think it's probably the most negative poem in the whole, out of the 5, and absolutely the writer fought in the conflict. He was right there on the front line, wasn't he? If you remember that really sad story, well, it's not a story because it's true, a true story, I should say, of him dying very close to the end of the war. He was shot by a sniper, wasn't he? Okay, Mammoth's Wood. Also World War One. So we've got lots of similarities in the top line so far. It's not really from a specific person's perspective. Obviously, we can see it as Shears himself visiting these fields and wanting to celebrate his Welsh countrymen's sacrifice, etc. But really, we can describe the perspective is very modern. It's those people who can look back at war and look at the after effects of it. So that one's quite a tricky one. In terms of modern or war, this is definitely, modern or traditional, this is definitely both. So it does celebrate brotherhood and that idea of uniting the soldiers, like we've just spoken about, but it's also very negative about the wastefulness of war and how young and innocent they were, and the impact, what it costs. It was written in the 2000s. It is both positive and negative. It's mostly negative, isn't it? But there are elements of positivity in there. And I think if you ignore that, then you miss quite a lot of the key meanings in the poem, and it's kind of it's a bit limited if you don't address both the positive and negative. And again, Shears did not fight in the conflict. He wasn't even born. Okay, 2 more to go. A Wife in London. So, this was the Boer War, which was fought in South Africa. We're now looking at a wife's perspective, so that it's different to the others so far. It's definitely a modern war poem, but remember that Hardy was writing in 1899, so it's actually the oldest poem. So if you remember, even though he was writing during the time of traditional war poetry, he was a bit of a rebel. He went out and said, you know what, I'm not going to write a positive patriotic war poem. I'm going to write a realistic war poem that exposes what we lose from war. So he's definitely modern. He's definitely negative about the war, and he didn't fight in the conflict either. He was still at home. Okay, so that's Away from London. And then finally, the Manhunt. We've got the Bosnian conflict. It again now is the perspective of a wife, so we've now got 2 poems that have got something in common about perspective, as well as Dulce and the Soldier. It's modern again. It was written again in the 2000s. It's definitely negative in terms of the aftermath and what that costs. And I think the Manhunt's quite interesting because it doesn't focus on death, which is usually the focus of loss in many negative war poems. It's a different sort of death, isn't it? It's like a metaphorical death of the man she once knew. So it's an interesting twist on the loss of war and the negative ideas about it. And again, as Simon Armitage says on that YouTube video where he presents the poem, he absolutely did not fight in the war, so or was not involved in the conflict, so he chose somebody else's perspective instead. Okay, so hopefully you got most of those correct. If there's anything that you're not sure about, again, just ask your teacher or feel free to get in touch with me. But the key thing is really that you've got now a beautiful overview. I hope it's beautiful. I hope you've done super neat. Of all of this sort of similarities and differences of the poems, and it'll just help you as you move through the next 2 years in terms of that overview of what kind of comparative points you can make. Okay, so remember we're bigger picture at the moment. So what I'm going to do now is we're going to use this table to start having a think and answering this question: which poems have the most in common? Okay, so I have got some wonderful colour coding here, and you can shade in yours the same if you want to. It's up to you. So what I've done is, on each row, the poems that have got similarities I've put in the same colour, and I've mostly used orange, but on rows where there's two different groups of similarities, I've then used green. Okay, so on the first row, we've got the Soldier, Dulce and Mammoth's Wood that are all written about World War I, so that's a similarity, so I've coloured those in. On the second row, we've got Dulce and the Soldier, united by the fact that they're written from a soldier's perspective. But then we've got A Wife in London and the Manhunt that are both written from a wife's perspective, so they're united from that. They'd have a good chat about that in a little speed dating. In terms of modern or traditional, we've only really got the Soldier, which is an outright traditional poem. So that helps you, I think, in your comparisons to think, right, the Soldier's always going to be quite different to the others. And it's probably going to got, in terms of its presentation of war, it's going to have most similarities with Mammoth's Wood, because that's the only one that's got a bit of positivity in it. But we've got the three poems, Dulce, Wife in London and the Manhunt, that are all modern, so they're all united by that. In terms of when it was written, I've joined together the Soldier and Dulce because it's both written during World War I. And then I've joined together Mammoth's Wood and the Manhunt because it was a similar decade. And then A Wife in London stands alone there in being quite, it's actually not too much earlier than 1914, is it? But it's a whole different century. And again, you've kind of got, even though it's standing alone in terms of when it was written, it's still united with the Manhunt and Dulce in terms of its modern style. In terms of positive and negative, we've got Dulce, Wife in London and Manhunt that are all very negative. And at the bottom one, we've got everybody, nobody fighting in the actual conflict apart from Wilfred Owen. And that's one of the key reasons, I think, why his poem is so negative and horrific, because he's the only one who'd actually seen it firsthand to describe those horrible scenes that he witnessed. Okay, so obviously pause now if you'd like to shade in yours in the same way. I don't know if you've got colours, so I don't want to assume and tell you must do that. If you can, then do, because it will really help you to visualise and see very quickly where the similarities are. What I think is the key thing that comes out of this then, if you have a look, A Wife in London and the Manhunt are actually the poems that have the most in common in terms of these categories. So they're actually, the only thing that they don't have in common is the year they were written and which war they refer to. Everything else is the same. So they are almost like a perfect match. They've got an awful lot in common and would therefore be a really good set of poems to compare for similarities. What I think is quite interesting is that the Soldier and Dulce also appear to have quite a lot in common. They've got three categories in common, haven't they? The top two, and then the year that it was written. And I think what's important there to see is that actually when you think about those poems, they don't have that much in common. When you zoom in and you look at the meanings, they're actually very, they're in conflict with each other. They say very opposite things. I think that what that highlights is that while this overview table is really useful in terms of you organising your knowledge about the poems, this category, is it positive or negative about conflict, is by far the most important category when it comes to comparing these poems, because that is essentially what drives Dulce and the Soldier apart. Even though they have lots in common about when they were written and which war and whose perspective, actually Dulce being negative about war and the Soldier being positive about war just drives them apart. I don't think that they would be a very successful speed date at all. They'd be shouting across the table after 30 seconds. It would be most rude. So I just wanted to stress that to you, the importance of that category, and that actually what the writer's saying about war is by far the most important thing you need to be thinking about when you're comparing the poems. Okay, so in terms of most in common, they're the kind of key points I'd like to draw out. If you haven't been able to colour them in, you might want to just underneath your table jot down some notes about which have got the most in common and why Soldier and Dulce haven't got as much in common as you'd think. Okay, I think, one final thing to say is that Mammoth's Wood is very stands alone almost, doesn't it? Because it's the only one that kind of straddles across two perspectives, and has that sort of different perspective of looking back. Generically, I know the Manhunt. I know the Manhunt kind of has this, is focused on the after effects of war, but it's quite an immediate after effect. It's when the soldiers return home, or peacekeeper in Eddie's case. Whereas Mammoth's Wood is very long term, isn't it? So it really stands alone, Mammoth's Wood, and it's quite an interesting one to use for differences and similarities. Okay. So I've already answered this one, sorry. So which poems have the least in common? Mammoth's Wood is definitely the one, if you look, it's the one that's coloured in the least, isn't it? It's the one that is kind of not got many overlaps with the other two poems. Okay, and I've already gone through that. That's fine. Right, I'm going to shut now. I'm going to ask you to do something. So, as I said before at the start, we are going to slowly zoom in into specific categories of comparison. So that was our overview. And as I said, really we need to be zooming into this positive and negative aspects and sort of what are they saying. Oh, I'm so sorry, excuse me. And what are they saying about war? So the first thing I'd like you to zoom into is perspectives of conflict. Now, what I mean by perspective is whose viewpoint are we hearing from, who's narrating the poem, and what are they choosing to share with us, what is their perspective. So who's speaking to us, or who are we learning about the experience of, and what are they choosing to share. So what I'd like you to do in your books is, if you write perspectives of conflict as your title, or if you want to, you can sort of say who's narrating, what do they share as your title. And then can you draw this Venn diagram, please, and make sure you've got lots of space in the overlap bit in the middle where you're going to write your similarities, and lots of space outside the overlap where you're going to write your differences. Oh, I've just realised that I've said that I'm comparing A Wife in London with A Wife in London. Oh dear, no I'm not. I'm comparing A Wife in London and the Manhunt. Sorry. So can you make sure you write down, label one of your circles as the Manhunt. Okay, so pause now while you set up your page to look like this, except you're not going to be silly and write A Wife in London twice. Okay, I'm going to do this one with you, and then I'm going to ask you to have a go more independently at doing another one on two different poems, and then I'll give you the answers to that one so you can still check your work. Okay, so in terms of similarities for A Wife in London and the Manhunt, as we've already said, they're both written from the perspective of a wife, so that's a similarity that we can look at and pin down. However, there are differences in the perspective as well, and that's why I wanted to model this one for you, because if you want to be fantastic at making comparisons, then you need to be looking not only at what's similar, but also what's different. There's always computer crazy. Don't look. There's always differences there's always differences within similarities. Otherwise, they'd be literally the same poem, and then somebody would get sued. So that would be bad. Right. Similarity then, they're both written from the perspective of a wife. Differences. Let's see which one this must be. This one must be the Manhunt. So I've done the Manhunt on the right hand side. So the Manhunt is narrated in first person. The wife is speaking to us, whereas in A Wife in London, it's narrated in third person, isn't it? There is a narrator who's talking about the wife. She sits in a tawny vapour. Okay, now that's an important thing to focus on and a knowledge to have, and obviously you'd need to analyse that in detail when you write it up into an essay. We've also got in A Wife in London that it's the perspective of what it feels like to lose a husband, quite literally, like the husband dies. Whereas in the Manhunt, it's more about what it feels like to lose a husband metaphorically. So she's sharing her experience of finding a husband again, and who he is, and the man that she once knew, hopefully, if she can get there. Okay, and if he still exists. So that's a Venn diagram completed for perspectives for A Wife in London and the Manhunt. What I would like, you might be able to think of other things as well, but what I'd like you to do now is have a go yourself at doing this now for Dulce and the Manhunt. Okay, so again, you're thinking about who's narrating, who are we hearing from, and what are they telling us about, what are they sharing. So pause now and have a go at that for me, please. Okay, So I'm just going to go through the answers with you now. Now again, you might have different things because this is literature and there's many different ideas and ways of approaching this, but this is just what I've come up with. So firstly, both narrators are very negative about war, and they're both first-person narrators. If you could see what I've seen, I don't think that's a direct quote, sorry. And the Manhunt, only then did I come close. So first person, but they're very negative in terms of, I would say Dulce is more negative, but obviously neither of them are celebrating war, are they, like Brooke does, sorry. The Manhunt is written from the perspective of a wife trying to deal with the aftermath of war, whereas Dulce is written from the perspective of a soldier who is directly experiencing the war. Like it's more of a live experience, isn't it? We feel like we're there on the battlefield with him, especially during that gas attack scene. Okay, so they're the things that I've come up with. You might have come up with more, and that's amazing and fantastic. If you want to, you can share with your teacher so that they can tell the class and everyone can answer the notes. Or just, if you're not sure if what you've written is correct, then again, just ask your teacher or ask me. Okay, so just to finish off the lesson today then, we're going to look at one more category for comparison, and that is the impact of conflict. So I'm going to ask you now to have a go at comparing these specific poems, but rather than focusing on perspective and who we're hearing from, this time you're going to focus on comparing what do the poets suggest is the impact of war and conflict. What do they suggest happens as a result of it? Okay, so if you write the impact of conflict as a subheading, and these different categories are different ways to approach your comparison. You need to zoom into different aspects of the poems when you're comparing so that you really make a nice thorough comparison rather than the overview from that table, which will just kind of give you it's not really deep meaty comparison. Okay, so the first two poems are The Manhunt and A Wife in London. I'd like you to have a go at writing down a similarity and a difference in terms of how they present the impact of conflict. For Dulce and the Soldier, and I just want you to focus on a difference, and Mammoth's Wood and the Soldier, I'd just like you to focus on a difference as well. So those two are slightly easier. What I'd like you to do is start trying to use connectives in these sentences. So as you're having a go at this, see if you can use, both poets similarly, however, alternatively, so that you're starting to think in terms of comparative sentences as well. Okay, so pause the video now, go back to your poems, go back to your notes and have a go. What does each poem suggest about the impact of conflict? Okay, make sure you pause, otherwise I'm going to go through the answers. Okay, so here are the answers. So change colour pen please, add to your notes and fill in any gaps. Remember, you might have said something different and it doesn't mean it's wrong. So for the Wife in London and Manhunt, my similarity is that they both highlight the impact of conflict on the wives and those at home. Okay, we're not learning about, we are learning about the impact on the soldier, on Eddie in the Manhunt, but we're very much seeing it from the wife's perspective, aren't we? And the impact on the wife as she journeys to find her husband again. A key difference though is that Hardy focuses on the impact of death, whereas Armitage focuses on the impact of injury and psychological effects, not only on him but on his wife as well. Okay, now what I'm hoping you can see is that there's a bit of similarity here between this category and the previous category about perspectives. We're actually writing very similar things. Yeah, and what that I think highlights, or I'm hoping it highlights to you, is that once you have a solid understanding of these poems, you are able to make such a massive range of arguments on them and so many comparative links. But getting that core understanding of the poems first is essential, and hopefully you do feel like you've got that. And if not, remember, you've got time in year 10 to go back over them. Okay, Dulce and the Soldier, the key difference is obviously that, this is not an exhaustive list. There's so much that Owen focuses on in terms of impacts of war. So, for example, you got the loss of innocence, horrifying experience, the loss of the senses. Remember, men marched to sleep, they were deaf, as in DEAF, and obviously literally death. The idea of watching somebody die, and not only the impact of the death itself, but also imagine having seen that scene, the long-term damage that would do to you. However, Brooke very much suggests that the impact of soldiers dying is a great thing. It makes the foreign language English. Woohoo! So the impact is presented completely the opposite way in the soldier. You know, his death is not considered to be tragic. His death is considered to be something to celebrate because he's being patriotic and celebrating England, and it's sort of spread to foreign lands. Okay. And then finally, Mammoth's Wood and the Soldier, the key difference is that Shears focuses on the devastating impact of war on the land and the loss of life. In terms of impact of war, that idea of the soldiers being united, you could perhaps focus on. I don't know, there's something in the word impact that makes me kind of lean more towards thinking about that devastating loss, really. However, Brooke celebrates the loss of life. Sounds morbid to say, but that's exactly what he does, isn't it? And he suggests, actually, whereas Shears focuses on the damage done to the land, Brooke actually suggests the land will become richer because there will be a richer dust concealed and it will become English, so therefore it will be better. That jingoistic idea. Okay, so that's again a key difference. Right, I'm just going to double check. Yes, so that is the end of today's lesson. So just to recap, what we've done is we've started off with an overview of the main similarities and differences between the poem. We've categorised them by very basic categories such as date written, whether the writer fought in the war, and then we've zoomed in a little bit and gone into sort of meatier comparisons, and we've had a look at the impact of conflict and how each poem presents that, and we've had a look at perspective and whose perspective we're seeing war from. And again, we've had a look at that. In part 2 of the lesson, you will be sort of looking a little bit more in detail about specific parts of the poems and making links. We're just going to focus on one specific category for the whole lesson, but it'll be a bit more involved in terms of using quotes from the poems and things like that. Okay, thanks very much for your time. I hope you found this useful. Please let me know any feedback. And like I say, if you've got any questions at all, please do ask. Because that's the whole point. We want you to learn. All right, take care, and I'll speak to you again.